Comparative Literature Luncheon lecture. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to note that today's sponsors include the Department of Comparative Literature, the Center for Global Studies, and the Center for Humanities and Information. Next week's talk, on Monday, October 2nd, will be Alan Golding from the University of Louisville. Avant-gardism Against Itself, Conversation and the Reader Critic in the Little Review. So please come to that event, same time, same place, next Monday. I do have a couple of announcements for upcoming events. Today at 4 p.m., there is a talk on Sacagawea's capture of the history of the early West by Elizabeth A. Penn. This is sponsored by the Department of History. Professor Penn is a professor of Western American history at the University of Colorado. And she's also the winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for History, 2015 Pulitzer Prize for History, for her book on the Mandan, who are, as you know, the indigenous peoples, some of the indigenous peoples of the American Plains. That talk is today at 4 p.m. in the Alumni Fireside Lounge at the Nittany Lion Inn. Then on Wednesday, the Center for Global Studies is presenting an Arabic film screening, Captain Abu Raid. This will be Wednesday, September 27th, 7 to 9 p.m. at the Foster Auditorium in the Paternal Library. So those are a couple of events that you might be interested in. So today's speaker comes from the University of Wisconsin. Jane Gallop, I just found out, grew up in Duluth, Minnesota. I am from Minneapolis, and I tell everyone here when it gets cold, oh, you have no idea. Cold really is. And now I have met someone who can say to me, in Minneapolis, you have no idea what cold really is. You don't know where Duluth is, right? It's on Lake Superior in the northern part of the state of Minnesota. All right, so the introduction for our distinguished speaker is going to be presented by our very own Eric Heigl.
Hi folks, so it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Gallop to you. I'm going to do it quickly because we only have so much time and it's better to be in Q&A than be an introduction. But I will say that Jane was my teacher for many years, and that all of the things that, if you like things about me, all of those things that you like are the product of Jane's teaching. And if you don't like things about me, they're things that I somehow resisted instruction on. Jane has been writing for a long time. She has 9 books, the first of which came out in 1981. The last of which came out in 2011. This talk is from a book that hopefully will come out in 2018 from Duke. She is a scholar who is, and a person who is a relentless interrogator of the world and of the text. She's someone who really consistently throughout her career, I think maybe partly became famous initially because of this, but it's not a gimmick, it's an ethos and a way of being for Jane, who continually sees and thinks about the ways in which the scholar herself is at play in the work of scholarship, and has to be put into play by the work of scholarship in order for the scholarship to be true to something that's more than simply a kind of act removed from the world as we live in. So I'll stop there and just say that she's great and she changed my life. So I doubt she'll change yours in the next hour, but maybe she'll move it in one small direction or another, and I hope that happens to you, because it happened to me and it was pretty fantastic and important. So please join me in welcoming Jane Gallop.
I did. Thank you, Eric. It is one of the great pleasures of the second half of my career is to visit my ex-students and see them as faculty members in wherever they are. And so that's just, for me, an extra pleasure of this trip, aside from the chance to talk to you about this book I'm working on now. Over the last decade, there has been a flourishing of writing at the intersection of disability and sexuality studies. Theoretically bold work informed by queer theory that radically challenges normativity and militantly asserts bodily difference. My current book project owes its inspiration to that body of work, sometimes called crypt theory, to writers like Robert McRuer, Eli Clare, and Reva Lehrer. Unlike the work that inspires me, however, my project includes in its intersectional focus not just disability and sexuality, but also aging. It is generally recognized not only that disability and aging studies frequently have common cause, but also that there is a wide swath where the categories of disability and aging bleed into each other. For example, Michael Barabay of Penn State, a leading figure in disability studies, writes, "The fact that many of us will become disabled if we live long enough is perhaps the fundamental aspect of human embodiment." In such a statement, disability becomes pretty much synonymous with aging. Statements like this are found everywhere in disability studies, suggesting a widespread recognition that disability cannot be separated as a category from aging. Yet, despite the frequency of this gesture, there is little critical or theoretical work that draws from both disability and aging studies. My current work has the good fortune to benefit from both of these critical traditions. The focus of my book is, in fact, the swath of experience that could be equally understood either as disability or as aging. The experience of what I will call late onset disability, disability beginning in the middle years or beyond. My particular subject is how late onset disability is lived sexually. My book will trace how late onset disability is lived as a threat to one's sexuality and to one's gender. But the book will also trace how sexuality survives and transforms in the process, a sexuality becoming, in these older, less able subjects, more perverse from a normative standpoint, more deviant from an ageist, ableist standpoint. Taking its anti-normative audacity from queer and especially crypt theory, my current work explores and celebrates the perverse sexuality of the no longer young, no longer fit. While disability studies has generated so much lively queer theory and vice versa, there is virtually no work at the intersection of queer theory and aging. Yet there is, in fact, an obvious place where the two could easily and productively hook up. For more than a decade, the most influential trend in queer theory has been the exploration of what is called queer temporality. Scholars as diverse and as influential as Judith Halberstam, Lee Edelman, and Elizabeth Freeman, to name just three, have brought the resistance to normativity and the valuation of alternative lives that characterize queer theory to bear on various aspects of temporality. A queer angle on temporality has obvious relevance for aging, which is all about temporality, which is literally the lived experience of temporality. Yet, although theorists of queer temporality have focused on childhood and adolescence, and despite the obvious relevance, there is virtually no work applying queer temporality to aging adults. The concept of temporalities in this project and in my title arose from the application of all this wonderful theorizing of queer time to the question of adult aging. The title's inclusion of the phallus, on the other hand, is, I imagine, more surprising, more troubling, and needs more explanation. This is especially true because the notion has fallen out of favor in the last 20 years of theorizing sexuality. As someone who decades ago contributed to the feminist critique of the psychoanalytic concept of the phallus, I was surprised to find the term suggesting itself as I moved into my current subject. On the basis of the work I have been doing, I believe the reintroduction of the notion of the phallus, denatured by 3 decades of queer theory, has a substantial contribution to make to our theorization of sexuality as lived in and over time. In psychoanalytic theory, the phallus is conceptually inseparable from castration. This makes the phallus an essentially temporal concept. The phallus is what one had in the past but lost, or what one has in the present but fears losing in the future. This is the normative temporality of the phallus, that the phallus has been or will be lost, that the phallus is imbued with pastness, whether in the present or in the future. This overwhelming pastness of the phallus, its insistent connection to loss, even when it is present, is what we call, psychoanalytically, castration anxiety. Both late-onset disability and aging are experienced as threats to one's sexuality and to one's gender, regardless of the gender with which one identifies. This sense of impending loss, a loss tangling together gender and sexuality, can best be understood, I propose, as a form of castration anxiety. The psychoanalytic notion of castration anxiety is thus useful for thinking about how aging and late-onset disability are lived sexually. In the standard narrative we call castration anxiety, once the phallus is lost, it is lost forever. In addition to outlining this normative temporality, my project explores other temporalities of the phallus, alternatives to the lose it once and for all normative temporality, alternatives to the phallus's insistent relegation to the past. In addition to articulating the phallus as a temporal concept in its traditional psychoanalytic formulation, this book tracks alternative temporalities where one could move from castration to phallus, as well as in the other direction, where the lost phallus is surprisingly regained, or where the phallus might appear not only in the past, but as a promising future. These alternatives participate in the promise of queer temporality and may even lead to queerer phalluses and less anxious castrations. My book aims to lay out a vision of sexuality that is insistently temporal, and a temporal sexuality that is not normatively tragic, but multi-directional, holding open the possibilities of queer phallic surprises and post-castratory delights for older and less able adults. The temporality of castration anxiety is the scenario of an impending future losing it once and for all. As it turns out, this is the prospect we find over and over, both in late-onset disability and in midlife aging. This is the temporality that Margaret Morgenroth Gallop, scholar of midlife aging, calls the decline story. Connecting Gallett's decline story to the psychoanalytic notion of castration anxiety is central to the theoretical underpinnings of my current work. In her 1997 book, Declining to Decline, Gallop fleshes out the concept of the decline story by telling about the debilitating back pain that befell her at age 49. Her story is a good example of my book's particular focus, a disability whose onset arises in midlife, an experience that can be equally understood as either disability or aging. She goes to see an orthopedic surgeon who tells her, "You're not an old woman, but you have to be careful. You can't do the things you did when you were young." The visit to this doctor leaves her in a state of abject loss. It took me only a few hours to figure out that I had just gotten the worst news of my personal life, she writes. I extrapolated from the nerve pain I had been feeling. Whenever that began to worsen, my workday would gradually shorten. I would slowly become disabled and dependent. I was plunged into planning my suicide. The doctor pronounces, "You can't do the things you did when you were young." The patient hears that, imagines a future of progressive decline, and is plunged into planning her suicide. Gallep's book teaches us that such moments of entrance into catastrophic loss typify our culture's construction of aging. The rest of what I will present to you today consists of two sections from the book I'm working on. Both sections are from a larger chapter entitled High Heels and Wheelchairs. As you might imagine from the title, the chapter focuses on mobility issues, more specifically on issues around walking and prosthetic apparatuses. The first section I will present here is entitled Gender and Disability. The second is entitled The Phallus in the Wheelchair. Gender and Disability. Eli Clare's Exile and Pride, first published in 1999, one of the first books to combine queer and disability perspectives, is now a classic text of crip theory. Clare teaches us to think the intersection of gender and disability. The mannerisms that help define gender, he writes, the ways in which people walk, swing their hips, take up space with their bodies, are all based upon how non-disabled people move. A woman who walks with crutches does not walk like a woman. A man who uses a wheelchair does not move like a man. The construction of gender depends not only upon the male body and female body, but also upon the non-disabled body. For my chapter, High Heels and Wheelchairs, I am, of course, particularly interested in Clare's focus on gender and walking. As valuable as Clare is for explicating the relation between gender and normative walking, his temporality is not the one I'm concerned with here. For my purposes, I am drawn to a group of writers whose crypt gender trouble comes upon them in adult life, wreaking havoc upon their already formed gender identities. I will here cite three of these writers, not only because they display the temporality of late onset disability, but also because the gender identities threatened by their disabilities are not male-female, but butch-femme, queer gender. In a 1992 collection of butch-femme writings, I found Mary Frances Platt talking about wheelchair use and femme identity. As lives go, mine changed, she writes, slowly at first and then more dramatically. Recurring back pain and limited range of motion. Soon after came decreased mobility. I began to use a three-wheeled power chair. The more disabled I became, the more I mourned the ways my sexual femme self had manifested through the non-disabled me. Let us note the temporality of Platt's story. Her life changed, a slow decline ending in a wheelchair. Platt entitles her little essay, Reclaiming Femme Again, because she frames her difficulty claiming femme identity after disability as a repetition of an earlier difficulty. The 70s brand of white feminism had me trimming my nails and cutting off my hair. Soon I was outfitted in farmer jeans and high tops. Eventually I pulled the pieces of my being back together and proclaimed boldly, I am a working class lesbian femme. So I had maybe 6 years of unleashing my seductive femme self when, as lives go, mine changed. Fighting against the loss of femme identity because of her disability feels like a repetition of her fight against the 70s feminist rejection of that identity. I identify with Platt's relation to 70s feminism, and even more with her mourning her femme self. But what I love most about her essay is a sexy twist she gives to the image of the wheelchair. I hang out more with the sexual outlaws now, you know, the motorcycle lesbians who see wheels and chrome between your legs as something exciting. An essay published 7 years later in a collection of lesbian writing on disability tells a similar story of femme identity threatened by disability. Like Platt, Sharon Waxler has chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome, but Waxler also has multiple chemical sensitivity. She feels a similar threat to her femme identity, but not because of mobility issues. When I lost the markers of femme identity, she writes, I missed them terribly and wondered if I was still femme. One of the most upsetting losses was makeup, specifically lipstick. Waxler's loss throws her into a struggle with gender identity. It is this loss that threatens gender identity that I am here calling castration. While classic psychoanalytic theory believes castration is the loss of masculinity, this lesbian femme writing suggests that one can also experience the loss of femininity as castration. In her essay, Waxler prefaces her own dilemma with a story of another lesbian confronting disability. A year before her own fall into what she calls the deep, murky waters of illness and disability, Waxler attends the monthly Femme Butch Rap at the Gay and Lesbian Health Center. I remember one woman in particular with soft red hair, Waxler recounts. She said she had a disability and it made her question her identity as butch. Wasn't the butch supposed to be the doer? The one who says, let me get that for you, honey. I remember thinking, I guess that's not a problem if you're femme. That last line is ironic because this recollection is the lead-in to the problems disability poses for Waxler's femme identity. But that's not a problem if you're femme is also true if by that we mean the relation between disability and being the doer. While both butches and femmes experience castration anxiety in response to disability, our particular anxieties point to gender-differentiated ways of being phallic. Classic psychoanalytic theory proposes that masculinity has to do with having the phallus, whereas femininity with being the phallus. Our reading of lesbian writing here might revise that as, while femmes are phallic because of how they look, butches are phallic because of what they do. A particularly moving account of butch confrontation with disability appeared in the 2003 special issue of the queer theory journal GLQ on disability studies. This remarkable text certainly echoes Waxler's red-headed butch in her sense that the butch is the doer. But whereas Waxler's butch does chivalrous things like, get that for you, honey, in S. Naomi Finkelstein's text, the butch's doing is explicitly and graphically sexual. How can I be a butch without my hands, she writes. How can I fuck when my muscles shudder as a result? One of the worst things by far is that I cannot feel the nerves in her cunt or her asshole as I used to. I cannot move deftly enough over her clit. Finkelstein's text begins with 2 pages of hardcore description of sexual activity, and then 2 pages in, 2 detailed sexy pages in, disability makes its unwelcome entrance. If it is possible to fuck her as hard as we both want, then I'm doing just that. My arm is at an angle that my neck, with 3 bone spurs going into my vertebra, does not like. My body starts to shake. My arm and then my hand go numb. I am still fucking her, but I cannot feel the smooth inside of her anymore, and my neck is screaming in anguish. Finkelstein nonetheless succeeds in making her femme come. My back is in a spasm, but I ignore it. I finish fucking her through gritted teeth. She comes, she finishes. After describing in some detail the physical manifestations of her femme's orgasm, she writes, in my mind's eye, my own cock explodes as she comes. I get that much pleasure from her climax. In my mind's eye, my own cock explodes, she writes. This is surely in part why, in my attempt to understand queer modes of the phallus, I so value Finkelstein. Despite the detailed account of the butch's pain, the episode is sexy to read, with the exception of the final paragraph. Here's how the story ends. While she rests, I go into the bathroom to take a muscle relaxant and to the kitchen to get an ice bag. The next day I have to go to the emergency room for Toradol, a major anti-inflammatory that leaves me unable to eat for 2 days because it makes me nauseous and gives me the runs, but it does take the swelling down. The ending of her story is literally anticlimactic, but the ending of the story is not the end of Finkelstein's text. Powerful as it is, the anecdote only takes up about a quarter of the text. The rest is not narrative, but thoughts about her life as a crypt butch, which includes not only candor about her disability, but also insistence on her ongoing sexuality, on her persistent desire. Like Platt and Waxler, Finkelstein experiences her disability as a threat to her gender identity, but probably because her identity is butch, not femme, it is easier to hear that threat as castration. How is a butch supposed to stay butch when her body is not cooperating? I have felt emasculated by my disease. As I try to think through the temporalities of castration here, tracing the ways that adult onset disability affects the phallus, Finkelstein's text is particularly valuable to me. Like Platt, Finkelstein experiences the threat disability poses to her gender identity as a repetition. Platt, titling her essay Reclaiming Femme Again, frames disability's threat to her identity as a repetition of the 70s feminist rejection of femme. Finkelstein connects disability's threat to society's disapproval of butch women. I have paid many a price for being butch. Hell, I have almost been killed more than once for being a butch. I have lived with all these sanctions and stayed a butch because of my fierce love for women, my need to be inside them. But how can I be a butch without my hands? After all I have lived through and endured, I face losing the capacity to be butch? Damn, that has to be a bad joke. I'm interested in the temporality suggested by both Platt and Finkelstein. In their accounts, disability's threat to gender is a repetition. They experienced a similar threat long before disability ever appeared, and their experience of the threat as a repetition allows them, in the face of disability, to, as Platt puts it, reclaim their gender again. Both Platt and Finkelstein end their text by proclaiming their desire. Finkelstein ends, nothing that they did or that has happened, not the streets or abuse or being a crip has killed it. My desire is still intact. The beauty of desire in all its rawness and untamed hope still leaves my throat scratchy and dry, and it's the taste of glory. Platt ends, now my femme is rising again. This lesbian femme with disabilities is wise, wild, wet, and wanting. I read rising again as the mark of a certain phallic temporality, one that manifests as repetition. These stories of lesbian gender and adult onset disability are stories of castration. But the temporality is not one where castration, when it happens, is once and for all. It is where the phallus is lost and then regained more than once in a repetition, rising again. Platt, Waxler, and Finkelstein all tell stories of late onset disability as castration. All end by affirming the persistence of their desire. I want to contrast this phallic temporality with the standard one, where castration, when it occurs, is once and for all. The phallus in the wheelchair. While the previous section of my talk presents texts with alternative sexual temporalities, I chose the text for this section because it is such a clear and familiar version of normative phallic temporality. And because it quite explicitly and pointedly articulates disability with the phallus. If the wheelchair is, in our culture, the very icon of disability, the wheelchair is most famously linked to castration in D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. In that 1928 novel, Lord Chatterley in his wheelchair is the castrated foil to the phallic hero Mellors. Lady Chatterley's Lover gives us a particularly readable version of the standard castration narrative for adult onset disability. The novel displays a sort of symptomatic overemphasis on Clifford Chatterley's wheeled mobility devices, manifest, for example, in its repeating the same sentence almost verbatim in 2 succeeding chapters. In chapter 1, he could wheel himself about in a wheeled chair, and he had a bath chair with a small motor attachment so he could drive himself slowly around the garden and into the park. And in chapter 2, he could wheel himself about in a wheeled chair, and he had a sort of bath chair with a motor attachment in which he could puff slowly around the park. Lady Chatterley's Lover works to ensure that when we think of Lord Chatterley, we think of him in a wheelchair. I want to return to Lawrence's novel, a veritable treasure trove of aggressively normative sexuality. Returning to that novel, I discover an emphasis on temporality. For example, chapter 2 ends thus. Time went on. Whatever happened, nothing happened. Time went on as the clock does, 8:30 instead of 7:30. Exploring the temporal dimensions in Chatterley will allow me to formulate the normative temporality of the phallus and will help outline alternative phallic temporalities. Lady Chatterley's Lover is a celebration of the most normative version of phallic sexuality. When the female protagonist gives herself to the phallic man, she of course becomes pregnant. When she rejects her husband because of his war injury, it is widely and repeatedly said that it is because he cannot give her a child. Although scandalous in 1928 for its explicit sexual scenes, this novel is a paean to the superiority of reproductive sexuality. It is a definite pleasure for me to juxtapose Lady Chatterley's normative phallus with the alternative queer phalluses I have found in lesbian writing. The novel's phallic hero, Mellors, in fact expresses a particular animus for lesbians. It's astonishing, Mellors says, how lesbian women are, consciously or unconsciously. Seems to me they're nearly all lesbian. I could kill them. When I'm with a woman who's really lesbian, I fairly howl in my soul, wanting to kill her. Comments like this make me glad to locate the phallus in S. Naomi Finkelstein's lesbian Crip Butch mind's eye, instead of in Mellors, who militates here and throughout the novel for the most normative reproductive sexuality in the name of the phallus. I read Lady Chatterley's Lover, I read Lady Chatterley's Lover as a teenage girl in the 1960s, trying to keep up with the sexual revolution. This was supposed to be liberating sexuality, and it made me feel completely inadequate. It was only many decades later, finding myself in a wheelchair, that I thought of returning to the book to look at Lord Chatterley, to wonder how his disability figured in this expression of normative sexuality. When I did return to the book, I found not only the normative view of disability as castration, but an emphatic sense of castration as a temporal mode. The novel opens thus. Ours is essentially a tragic age. The cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. This was more or less Constance Chatterley's position. The war had brought the roof down over her head. We might recognize this as the classic modernist sense of the effect of the Great War. It is also what I am calling classic castration temporality. This is where the novel locates its heroine and its reader before it introduces any characters or action. Soon enough, it becomes clear that while the tragedy, the cataclysm, seems general in the opening sentences, it specifically refers to what happened to Constance Chatterley's husband. In the very next paragraph, we read, "She married Clifford Chatterley in 1917. Then he went back to Flanders to be shipped over to England again, more or less in bits. The lower half of his body from the hips down, paralyzed forever, crippled forever, knowing he could never have any children, Clifford came home." Paralyzed forever, crippled forever. Forever is the temporal mode here. Its other expression is the never of never having children. Because of his war injury, Clifford is a husband who cannot be a father. The effect of this on Lady Chatterley and in the view of the book is a generalized sense that ours is essentially a tragic age. When the narrator says, "We are among the ruins are a generalized extrapolation from Clifford, who is more or less in bits. I want here to pursue the temporality of the novel's opening, the tragic age, the cataclysm has happened, paralyzed forever, crippled forever. This sense of general tragedy, of forever, that we find in the very first paragraphs of Lady Chatterley's Lover is what Margaret Gallop calls a decline story. To exemplify the decline story, Gallop quotes Gerald Early, writing about his state of mind after a gallstone operation. "I knew then, at that inexorable moment, that I had become, finally and forever, middle-aged." Inexorable moment, finally and forever. These are the markers of Gallet's decline story, the markers of tragedy of what I'm here calling conventional castration temporality. Gallet discusses decline in relation to the entrance to middle age, an entrance understood as a tragic fall. Clifford Chatterley is, however, only 27 when paralyzed from the hips down. His story is not about aging, but about the loss of the ability to walk, to be upright, and to father children. While these are arguably two different modalities of loss, my point here is that they are confronted through the same temporality, the temporality of finally and forever, of the inexorable moment. Like the entrance to middle age, adult onset disability is framed through the dramatic temporality of forever. While middle age and disability might be two different modalities of loss, many people in fact experience them entangled together. Gallet's own personal story, for example, is of a back injury and the onset of chronic back pain as heralding her entry into middle age. Although Finkelstein categorizes her loss as disability, middle aging enters her account as well. That is the difference between me as a butch at 30 and me as a butch at nearly 40, she writes in her vivid account of becoming a crip butch. On the other hand, while Gerald Early categorizes his loss as entry into middle age, he is actually describing an experience of illness and hospitalization. It is the insistent entanglement of disability and the loss of youth that indeed characterizes what Gallet calls the decline story, the dominance of a certain temporality. A third strand in this tangle, I would add, is the loss of sexual potency, attractiveness, sexuality, i.e. castration. In her struggle against decline ideology, Gallet does not allow Early's story to remain in that inexorable temporality. She supplies the needed corrective. In time, Early returned to health, teaching in a prestigious writing career, Gallet writes. Although he doesn't mention such things, he goes on to show that he did not remain utterly despairing. It would probably have been truer for him to write, "I felt for that agonizing moment that middle age was going to be a tragedy forever. I was wrong." Just as Gallet insists that Gerard Early actually had a diverse and full life after his dramatically declared inexorable moment, I want to return to Clifford Chatterley to consider what his life was like after his tragic loss. In particular, I want to look at his sexuality after paralysis. I want to look at how the novel describes the sexuality of the man in the wheelchair. In the last chapter of the novel, after his wife has left him, after she is pregnant by Mellors, thus after the inexorable has run its course, we find Lord Chatterley in the care of Mrs. Bolton. Their relationship has become increasingly sexual, although the novel shows nothing but contempt for this perverse sexuality. I take the liberty of quoting at some length. He would hold her hand and rest his head on her breast, and when she once lightly kissed him, he said, "Yes, do kiss me, do kiss me." And when she sponged his great blonde body, he would say the same, "Do kiss me," and she would lightly kiss his body, anywhere, half in mockery. And he lay with a queer, blank face like a child. It was sheer relaxation on his part, letting go all his manhood and sinking back to a childish position that was really perverse. And then he would put his hand into her bosom and feel her breasts and kiss them in exultation. The exultation of perversity of being a child when he was a man. The narrator expresses strong disapproval, really perverse, the exultation of perversity. The disapproval issues from the perspective of normative sexuality. It is not that this isn't sexual, it is that this is a childish sexuality, what Freud, by the time Lawrence is writing, had famously called infantile sexuality, contrasting it with adult reproductive sexuality. In the early 20th century, Freud had established the correlation between perverse and infantile sexuality, and that is indeed what we see here from the perspective of the narrator's disgust. It is not that Clifford Chatterley has no sex life, but that his sex life is not normal. in the word exaltation here, the word twice repeated, and also bodied forth in all those exclamation points where the text quotes the excited Chatterley. Yes, do kiss me. Exaltation, the state or feeling of intense, often excessive exhilaration and well-being, rapture, elation. Exaltation and euphoria both involve a sense of extreme personal well-being, but exaltation is the stronger and more elevated term. Exalt, from Latin exaltare, to lift up, from ex up plus altus high. Exaltation connotes intense pleasure, but with an emphasis on verticality. That uplift is particularly interesting in relation to a man in a wheelchair, unable to stand. It is also, I would suggest, phallic. Clifford Chatterley's narrative arc begins with his castration in the Great War and seems to continue as an inexorable decline. As the novel progresses, he loses more and more, fulfilling the loss inevitable from the beginning, as his wife grows distant from him, cuckolds him, and leaves to have a child by another man. But this late scene with Mrs. Bolton suggests a different phallic temporality, one where the lost phallus can return in another place. What returns is not the normative phallus, the one belonging to a man, not a child, not the phallus that can impregnate a woman, but a perverse phallus, one no less exalting. If we release ourselves from the normative hold of reproductive sexuality, we can enter into other phallic temporalities, where the inability to walk, or get it up, or be a man does not have to mean castration forever, where the phallus could rise again, in the wheelchair or in the mind's eye. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. Who would like to pose a question to our speaker?
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Just one question about the kind of distinction you're making between the texts from these women writers and D.H. Lawrence about different temporalities and so forth. And I just kind of I just wonder if there is the kind of appearance of a what I might call like a fatal temporality, an absolute temporality in the passage from Lady Chatterley's Lover, because it's talking about, this regression to childhood, and I don't know if it's implied that, I'm not familiar with the novel, I haven't read it, so I don't know very well. But there's this regression to a childhood which seems kind of possibility that he could recuperate that, and so there seems to be also kind of not completely terminal temporality in that. And I was just wondering just to kind of challenge or to reflect on the other temporality presented to the women writers.
Okay, so I don't think we disagree. I think I didn't make something quite clear, which is that the very end is actually a twist on what I was saying about Chatterley in the beginning, because I like twist endings. So although I say I went to Lady Chatterley's because it has the most normative temporality of the phallus, and it does, as its major narrative arc, have this normative temporality in which it literally starts with the castrated Chatterley, and everything just gets worse and worse for him. That temporality, and that's what people mainly remember, because people mainly focus on Mellors and Constance. I couldn't even remember this scene, and I've actually given this paper to a number of people, including people who really know this now pretty well, and nobody remembers this scene. Nobody's written about it. Nobody cares about Clifford Chatterley, but Clifford Chatterley seems to have a sex life and seems to be very much enjoying it. This is in the last chapter of the book, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is, although it appears that this novel has the most normative temporality of the phallus, in fact there is an alternative temporality in the novel if we focus on what happens to the man in the wheelchair, which is not just, complete decline and loss, but actually something else. So I think that's what you're saying, which is that I'm actually, where I end is actually saying that it's true that the narrator seems to want to deny that this is anything phallic or good, but I'm basically saying no, we read this there's some kind of new displaced queer phallus here, right at the end of what looked like it was just going to nothing. So yes, I agree with you.
Great, yeah, thanks, I figured it was, yeah, I didn't mean that as a.
No, I mean, I think I hadn't made that quite clear, right, yeah.
Just to follow on this line of thought, one of the things that's interesting to me about the book, if there's anything, is the class issues. And from that standpoint, Clifford is never without the phallus, right? I mean,
Right, because he's rich and powerful.
yeah, and
Right.
so I wonder if if there's something else going on if the story was told not from the standpoint of reading the novel as a sex novel, right? But reading it as a class novel, and there's stuff in there about he at when she finally falls in love, I think she calls him he calls her a Bolshevik, and so there's these sort of you know, the way these things kind of intertwine is interesting to me. And the other thing to say is there's a sequel written by Samuel Roth called Lady Chatterley's Husbands, in which Mellors becomes basically the phallocentric order is restored completely, and Mellors is less attractive, and Clifford becomes slightly more attractive and things. So.
Well, I've never read the sequel, so I have no opinion about that.
It's fan fiction, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't know it existed. I'm not sure I want to read it or not, but I think I will. But I think that, well, there's a couple things I want to say. I did think some, I mean, the class stuff is very clear. I mean, that's part of why his name is Lord Chatterley, right? And he also becomes very successful in business as it goes on. And I haven't been able to figure out, and wasn't really able to figure out, how to think about the class stuff in relation to the disability stuff.
Well, Mellors is disabled in that regard.
Right, no, I know,
Right.
but partly because what I wanted to do is I wanted to focus on, you know, what is a really sympathetic reading of Lord Chatterley by focusing on his queer sexuality as a disabled person. And I don't know how to fit a class reading. I didn't do that. The other question it reminds me of, though, which is really interesting, is that, so I spent some time thinking about, but didn't write about, and not going to write about, the fact that it's very clear what the narrator's relation is to Lord Chatterley and sexuality. But I was thinking, well, yeah, but like, what was Lawrence's relation to that? And I know that that's, you know, a road that's always treacherous to go down. But one of the really interesting things about Clifford Chatterley is that he was a writer. And the idea of him as castrated is always tied to his being a writer. As opposed to a man of action like Mellors, a guy who could kind of like go into nature and he would write. So although Lawrence's class location is very different than Clifford Chatterley, they are very much tied together by being writers and therefore being effete and castrated and all of this sort of stuff. So I think that the place, the oppositions and identifications between Lawrence and Lord Chatterley are really complicated and crossed in all kinds of ways. And you know, that's kind of, so I decided just not to go there, but to actually just try to write about the sexuality of literally the most famous character in English literature in a wheelchair. So, yeah.
So my question kind of goes to the book project as a whole, less than the chapter you presented on today. So legally speaking, HIV is a disability, and at the same time, scientific progress keeps showing that the life expectancy is going up and up and up for people living with HIV. So I was wondering, given previous work on queer time and HIV, whether or not the disease makes an appearance in the project as a whole, and if the rising life expectancy could be said to be something like a phallus regained.
Okay, it's a great question and a great connection. No, I don't have a chapter on HIV. It's not something that I write about. And I think that one of the things that was very complicated to me is that it seemed to me that although the interest in disability in queer theory in some way grew out of HIV and the importance of that, because HIV in its most kind of dramatic moment involved a lot of young people dying, there was no connection between disability and aging. And so because I'm kind of trying to follow that, I just kind of didn't go there. That stuff was, I basically didn't deal with all the queer disability stuff that doesn't deal with aging. I was trying to get at that. So that's one part of it. I think what you're saying though is also really, really interesting, which is that what HIV looked like in the 80s and 90s fit this kind of normative temporality of like, you know, you're into tragedy, basically, you're into tragedy. And what it fits now, at least in some places and in some worlds, you know, and more in the United States than necessarily in Africa, etc., it actually fits this more, well, actually there is life after, right? So it would fit that. So if I were writing about that, I guess I would want to focus on that. I mean, I think your connection is right. Yeah.
As a follow-up to that question, I'm wondering if the book project includes sections on intellectual and mental disability, particularly because people who have mental and intellectual disabilities are often said to occupy alternate temporalities anyway. And so regardless of age, I guess occupy certain statuses according to normative behavior.
Yeah, no, and I didn't. You know, and I think that, again, if I did, I would be most interested in focusing on things like dementia, which is late onset intellectual disability, but no, it isn't. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about what sort of responses or resistances you've gotten in kind of recuperating this concept of the phallus. So not only in the kind of normative mode that you want to critique, but also in the sort of alternatives that you're suggesting, alternative phallic temporalities. So yeah, maybe if you could speak to the kind of stakes of using that concept.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to. So first of all, the main response I've gotten is most every time that I present this work, someone says, yeah, but how can you separate the phallus from, you know, it's like male centrism, it's androcentrism, you know, like, but isn't that a problem? And I actually can't answer that question. I can't separate it from it. But I guess the stake of what I'm trying to do, it's become pretty traditional in the last 20, 30 years to assume that phallic sexuality is normative sexuality and normative sexuality is phallic sexuality, that the phallus is understood to be a normative term and a normative kind of sexuality. And I guess the stake of what I'm trying to do is I'm not interested in ceding the phallus to the normative. I'm interested in claiming the phallus because I think that the phallus still functions for lots of people, even though it's no longer a theoretically correct word. And so rather than critiquing the phallus, which is actually what I did in the 80s and 90s, and I thought the effect of the critique of the phallus is people stopped using the term and no longer had any way to talk about the way the phallus still functions in people's understandings of their gender and their sexuality and temporality, because you couldn't talk about it. And it seems to me that the biggest thing that got lost from my point of view is castration anxiety. And I think castration anxiety becomes an incredibly important term to understand both anxiety about aging and anxiety about disability. And the way that those affect, like the anxiety that you're going to lose your gender and or sexuality because you're aging or because you're disabled, and so I felt like I didn't set out to write about the phallus, I set out to write about the relation between disability, aging, and sexuality. But I kept coming into the fact that this just looks like castration anxiety. Once you have to talk about castration anxiety, you can't do it without talking about the phallus. So then the phallus returned to my theoretical project, and I found that I enjoyed claiming the phallus in all kinds of places, claiming S. Naomi Finkelstein as phallic in that moment in which she's phallic. Like that there was something about claiming that women have the phallus, that lesbians have the phallus, that queer people have the phallus, that people in wheelchairs have the phallus, right? Which is to say that, like, really pluralizing the phallus and queering the phallus rather than assuming that the queer was anti-phallic and the phallic was normative. Yeah.
I'm curious whether or not you coordinate what, at least in this talk, was a largely biographical and literary approach with a kind of sociological approach that deals with the fact that just on a sheer blatant level, the entire global population has gotten older. Something I'm thinking of like Hervé Jouvon's The Coming Body, or The Coming of the Body. The age of global populations has actually just significantly increased since post-World War II. And so I'm wondering whether this is something you deal with, because in part it also peeks in through the medical apparatus, right? The medical apparatus produces these kind of supplements that prop up the phallus. And so you even see that in Finkelstein. For her to exercise the phallus requires a medical visit, following which plays into the temporality of the phallus at work, even in that scene. So I'm curious if that's part of the project in any degree.
Well, so it doesn't sound quite the same as what you're describing, but there's another chapter in which I talk about old men's sexuality, impotence, the medical remediations, the medicalization of old men's sexuality, and that's something I talk about in a very different chapter, not about mobility. And so so it's certainly very much about medicalization and about the idea that comes from some sociologists who've been looking at this, that basically sometime in the late 20th century, old men's sexuality got medicalized, whereas women's sexuality had been medicalized earlier, and that has radically changed this, and I kind of try to take that on and think about the temporality of the phallus and all that. Yeah.
In the comment that you just made just before this, then are you essentially separating the phallus from the patriarchy?
I think I'm trying to seize it from the patriarchy, which doesn't mean, then that's what I mean by saying I think the phallus has been relegated to the normative,
right?
And I think that's actually deprived us of understanding of the way that the phallus functions in all kinds of other ways. But yeah, so what I'm calling the most traditional notion of the phallus is the reproductive phallus, is the phallus that basically impregnates women, right? And which has everything to do with patriarchy, and with the kind of sexuality that serves patriarchy rather than has some other relation to patriarchy. And it's weird. I mean, again, this is my experience. I didn't set out to reclaim the phallus. I set out to try to think about the sexuality of aging and disabled people. And then, but as I kept finding the usefulness of that, then I realized that, like, yeah, I don't want to give up that theoretical idea because it's really useful. And I realized that there was something really both normative and inaccurate about the way that the phallus is understood, about how it's only there in those normative places, like the idea that gay men's sexuality is not phallic ever doesn't make any sense at all. Just to name the most obvious place. And in fact, to the extent that gay men have tried to use the term the phallic and written about that, they're usually dismissed as too often, like too normative or too male-centric or too androcentric, etc. So I guess it's why I wanted to kind of locate myself in lesbian writing and in the phallus in lesbian writing, try to find that phallus and castration in lesbian writing. Yeah, Eric?
So I want to say just very quickly that, first of all, that the Chinese translation of the word Viagra is Wei Ge, and Wei means great, powerful, and Ge is older brother. And I've always loved that as a what Viagra is so,
it was just trying to that as a pun.
Because Wei Ge sounds like,
right,
and so it's, it's the sound and the words, and so that's genius, and obviously, it's a footnote probably for somebody somewhere. But the question I want to ask you is about the difference between the first and the second parts of your talk. One of the things that you set up, and the twist that you were making, right, is you set up the first talk, and it looks like the good example, and then Lady Shadow's Lover looks like the bad example. But then the twist of the tale is that it turns out Lord Charlie has sex. So I think there's a really interesting difference between the first two examples in which the phallus is reclaimed as what it was, right? So they have a certain relation that they see as phallic, and they've been accustomed to seeing as phallic, it makes them feel powerful. And there's a disability that threatens to take that away, and then they somehow fight through that and get back in it. And so they're in the wheelchair, but they're wet, or you're taking Toradol, but you're still making your part of your comment and so on. And the Lord Chatterley story, in which he seems to regain maybe a kind of, he comes back to the phallus, but in a very different way.
Right.
So can you talk more about that?
Not only can I should, I will, and in fact, the section that follows, the Lady Chatterley section, because these are actually both sections of the same chapter, the chapter that's called High Heels and Wheelchairs, and there are other sections too. But the Lady Chatterley section is the second last section, and then there's the conclusion in which I delineate the difference between the temporality of the two examples. And you've just delineated it accurately, so, but I'll just like show that you're right by repeating what you said. He was always a good student.
Thanks, Jane.
Which is that, yes, so the temporality in the lesbian butch femme examples is repetition. And it's good to see that there because it's still an alternative to the normative temporality in which once you lose the phallus, it never comes back. Because which is to say, this is already an alternative temporality, which is that you lose the phallus and it goes away and it comes back, and that there's a kind of alternation between castration and phallus rather than a once and for all. But the temporality in the Lady Chatterley's exhibit, although bears some resemblance because it is the possibility of a lost phallus returning, it returns in a different place and in a surprising place, and it returns as a different kind of phallus. What is lost is a normative phallus, and what returns is a queer phallus, or a perverse phallus, if you like. And so I see that as a different, though related temporality, and that the way that the book works is that gradually through the course of the book, I lay out what is the normative temporality, which is the straightforward way that we understand castration anxiety, which is that if you lose it, you're going to lose it forever, it'll never come back. Or the understanding of women as castrated, which is that they once had a phallus and they lost it, and again, they'll never get it back. And so that's the normative, but I actually outline multiple different alternative temporalities which is why it's called queer temporalities, plural, of the phallus, which is that I'm not saying, oh, this is the queer temporality, but that they're actually in experiential are lots of different temporalities of the phallus. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to build off that a little bit, and I think you already started to talk about this, to think about the ways that gender affects these different temporalities, because, the example that Eric pointed out of having to be different is obviously a man, and it's kind of this idea that he used to be a man, now he's not a man. What is he? Whereas the women were kind of engaging in these different temporalities. But it struck me from one of the very first things you said when you were citing the book, where the woman goes to the doctor, and he says, you can't do the things that you could when you were a young woman, or a girl, or something like that.
Young woman, yeah.
And it's just like...
When you were young.
When you were young. And it's like, yeah, but you get to do a lot of great things when you're older that you couldn't do when you were young. Like, give less shits about what people think about you, or things like that. And so I was just thinking about, like, how there are these different temporalities of being, like, an older woman as well. And so I was kind of just wondering how gender plays into these different temporal fallacies that you see.
Right, and gender is both functioning kind of throughout the book in really complicated ways, and is never kind of like laid out as, well, this is kind of how it works in relation to this. Because the first move I try to make is literally, maybe it's the first move, there's a lot of first moves, but one of the big moves is to say that castration means loss of gender and sexuality despite your gender, regardless of gender. Which is not, our usual understanding of castration is that it's loss of masculinity. So I spend some time trying to show it in like women and lesbians and femmes and all kinds of other non-masculine people. Because to make castration and the phallus useful is to pry it away from its connection to gender, in which being phallic is being masculine and being castrated is being feminine. So, and I spend some time in the introduction. So this book has a long theoretical introduction that is actually longer than any of the chapters, in which I'm trying to follow through all the different theoretical connections I'm making to kind of get to what this is. And I talk about the fact that if we start thinking about the phallus and castration in relation, if we think about castration in relation to aging, it just looks really, really different than if we think about it in relation to gender. Because when we think about gender, we're always imagining that there are these like two different static things, kind of essences, if you like. And if and you could lose one, and that's what it is. But if you think about aging, we're thinking about something in temporality. So castration has a more temporal notion in there, and then what would that mean? And although there's like I also base it on Kathleen Woodward has done a reading of aging in Freud to show that aging in Freud is castration, right? And so if we kind of centralize that more to what Freudian castration is, to include aging, then you have a very different, you would be emphasizing more. I mean, another place where I started is by saying the phallus is essentially a temporal notion because it's tied to castration, and those are different temporal moments. And we forget that when we think it's tied to gender. We just like lose that. It's not very, but when we tie it to aging, we don't lose it at all. So it's also about like kind of using, taking off from Woodward's understanding that one of the, that the way to understand, the Freudian way to understand aging is as castration, and where that all is. So, and that is pretty much irregardless of gender. Even though castration continues to have its relation to gender, because in aging, there's a lot of anxiety about losing your gender, right? As well as losing your sexuality. And even, and in different variations. So there's some people who are very comfortable with the end of their sex life, but are very anxious about the loss of their gender, and vice versa. Castration always includes this anxiety about loss of gender and anxiety about loss of castration, and they're together, but they're not together in any stable way, right? That seems to me how castration functions. And so the other thing is I actually understand the phallus based on castration rather than vice versa, which I think is actually just a kind of Lacanian thing to do. But I think that the chapter on old men's sexuality really is about men, right? So there's also a way in which gender really functions differently in different places as I focus on different aspects of it. And certainly I'm not complete in trying to figure out what the gender relation is. The main thing I want to do is kind of break the association in which castration is the loss of masculinity and open it up for just a wider range of understanding of gender.
Okay, looks like we're out of time, so let's thank our speaker again.